On the freezing morning of October 12, 1776, a British naval commander named Sir Guy Carleton stepped onto the quarterdeck of his flagship on Lake Champlain. Just hours earlier, his massive fleet of over 30 war vessels had trapped the entire American Northern Navy inside a narrow water channel. Carleton controlled the biggest, deadliest, and most advanced fleet ever assembled in North America. He had over 800 heavy cannons, seasoned Royal Navy tars, and a force of elite British and German troops ready to end the American Revolution in a single afternoon. Carleton ordered his gunners to prepare their cannons. He expected a quick slaughter, an easy surrender, or a desperate suicidal charge. What he saw instead, when the morning fog lifted, was empty water. An entire fleet of 15 American warships, packed with wounded men, damaged cannons, and dozens of starving sailors, had completely vanished into thin air during the pitch-black night. They had slipped right past the British battle line without firing a single shot, without making a single sound, and without a single British sentry noticing a thing. When word reached London that an entire colonial navy had pulled off an impossible midnight escape right under the nose of the Royal Navy, British officers were stunned. The man who designed that daring trap and guided that ghost fleet through the dark was a 35-year-old colonel named Benedict Arnold. Long before his name became synonymous with treason, Arnold was the most aggressive, reckless, and brilliant field commander in the Continental Army. So, how did a group of house carpenters, blacksmiths, and farm boys build a navy out of raw green timber in less than 60 days, bait the world's greatest superpower into a deadly water trap, and pull off a silent midnight escape that saved the American Revolution from total destruction? To understand why a fistful of wooden boats on a cold mountain lake mattered so much, you have to look at what was happening to the American cause in the summer of 1776. The Revolution was falling apart. George Washington's main army was being hunted across New York by British General William Howe. Thousands of American soldiers were dying of smallpox and starvation after a failed invasion of Canada. The Continental Congress had no money, no gunpowder, and no real military power on the water. The British strategy was simple, elegant, and completely deadly. They planned to launch a massive two-pronged invasion. General Howe would march north from New York City, while General Guy Carleton would march south from Canada, down the Lake Champlain corridor. The two armies would meet at Albany, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies like a severed limb. Without New England's food, weapons, and men, the rebellion in the South would starve and collapse in months. Standing in the way of this grand British invasion was a wilderness with no roads, dense forests, and a single 100-mile-long liquid highway called Lake Champlain. Whoever controlled that lake controlled the destiny of North America, and in July 1776, the British owned the water. To truly grasp how terrifying this moment was for the American colonies, you have to look at a map of North America in 1776. There were no paved highways, no freight trains, and no supply trucks. Moving an army of 10,000 men through the dense, uncharted forests of upstate New York was virtually impossible by land. The woods were thick, swampy, and full of hostile wilderness. The only practical way to move heavy cannons, tons of gunpowder, and thousands of troops was by water. Lake Champlain was a massive, narrow body of water stretching over 100 miles from Canada right into the heart of New York. It was the absolute key to the entire continent. If the British controlled Lake Champlain, they could float their massive army straight down to the Hudson River, take Albany, and slice the 13 colonies directly in half. By the summer of 1776, the American attempt to invade Canada had turned into a complete catastrophe. Continental troops were retreating south in total disgrace. Smallpox was ravaging the ranks. Hundreds of soldiers were dying in filthy camp hospitals, shivering from fever, covered in sores, and running out of basic rations. Deserters were slipping away into the woods every night. Morale had hit absolute rock bottom. General George Washington was trapped down in New York City, watching his own army get systematically outmaneuvered on Long Island. He knew he could send 0 reinforcements north. No extra troops, no extra cannons, and no money. Washington wrote desperate letters to Congress, warning that if the British broke through from Canada, the war was completely over. On the Canadian side of the lake, British General Guy Carleton was assembling a juggernaut. He had over 13,000 veteran British and German mercenary soldiers, fully equipped, well-fed, and eager for battle. But Carleton faced one giant problem. He could not march his massive force south until he had enough warships to protect his supply barges on the lake. The British started building a massive fleet at St. John's, near the northern tip of Lake Champlain. They did not just build small wooden boats. They brought over elite shipwrights from Britain, disassembled heavy warships from the Royal Navy, hauled the timber and iron through the woods, and reassembled them right on the lake shore. They were constructing heavy frigates, schooners, and gunboats, equipped with massive 24-pounder naval cannons that could obliterate wooden fortifications from half a mile away. The Continental Army had almost nothing on the water, a few tiny wooden rowboats and 2 small fishing schooners captured during earlier raids. Asking these small boats to stop the Royal Navy was like asking a wooden fence to stop a runaway freight train. If the British finished their fleet quickly, they would sail south, wipe out the small American garrison at Fort Ticonderoga, link up with General Howe in New York City, and crush the American Revolution before the Declaration of Independence was even 6 months old. The colonies needed a miracle. They needed someone crazy enough, aggressive enough, and relentless enough to stand up to the greatest navy on earth with nothing but raw trees and a handful of farm boys. That miracle came in the form of a short, muscular, dark-haired officer who refused to back down from any fight. His name was Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was not an admiral. He was an army officer who had made a living before the war as a merchant and sea captain. He had a hot temper, a massive ego, and a fierce, restless energy that made his superiors nervous. But Arnold understood something that almost no one else in Congress grasped. He realized that the Americans did not actually need to defeat the British Navy in a fair fight. They just needed to build enough boats to force the British to slow down and build a bigger fleet of their own. Arnold knew how cold northern winters worked. If he could delay Guy Carleton's invasion until late October, the freezing weather, mountain snowstorms, and icy lake winds would force the British Army to turn around and retreat back to Canada until spring. That delay would buy George Washington and the Continental Army an entire year to survive, rebuild, and keep the revolution alive. Arnold rode south to a tiny frontier settlement called Skensborough, located at the southern tip of Lake Champlain. When he arrived, he found a swampy clearing with a sawmill and a few log cabins. There was no shipyard, no naval dry dock, no seasoned timber, and no naval supplies. Arnold did not care. He immediately took total control of the site and transformed Skensborough into the first true shipyard in American history. He hired house carpenters, blacksmiths, joiners, and woodcutters from surrounding towns, promising them high pay and extra rations. Hundreds of men descended on the clearing with axes and saws. The conditions were brutal. Trees were chopped down in the surrounding wilderness and hauled straight to the sawmills. The wood was raw and unseasoned, meaning it was still dripping with tree sap while carpenters pounded it into ship hulls. Green timber usually warps, cracks, and splits under heavy cannon fire, but Arnold did not have 6 months to let the wood dry in the sun. He needed warships immediately. The builders ran out of proper ship canvas for sails, so they used rough sackcloth. They ran out of iron nails, so blacksmiths worked around the clock forging spikes from scrap metal. They had no naval rope, no proper caulking to seal the seams, and very little gunpowder. Despite the chaotic odds, Arnold's makeshift shipyard produced a fleet of flat-bottomed wooden gundelows and row galleys in under 2 months. These boats were awkward, slow, and ugly. They were basically floating wooden boxes with low sides, equipped with oars and a few heavy cannons mounted on the bow and sides. To man these wooden boxes, Arnold gathered roughly 800 men. They were not trained sailors. They were landsmen, land-sick farmers, teenagers, shopkeepers, and infantry soldiers who had never stepped foot on a warship in their lives. Arnold spent weeks teaching these farm boys how to row in unison, how to swab heavy cannon barrels, and how to fire naval guns without blowing themselves up. By late September 1776, Arnold had built a fleet of 15 makeshift vessels. It was a fleet made of dripping wet wood, held together by scrap iron, and crewed by green recruits. But it was on the water, floating, and ready for war. Now, Arnold needed to pick his ground. By early October 1776, British General Guy Carleton finally launched his massive invasion fleet from Canada. On paper, it was a terrifying sight. Leading the line was the Inflexible, a massive, fully rigged, three-masted warship carrying 20 heavy cannon. Behind her sat the Maria, the Carleton, a giant armed raft named the Thunderer, and over 20 heavily armed gunboats. The British had double the firepower, longer-range guns, and seasoned Royal Navy officers commanding veteran crews. Arnold knew that if his clumsy, green timber fleet fought the British in open water, Carleton's long-range naval guns would blow his wooden boxes out of the river before his men could even get close enough to fire back. He needed an asymmetric terrain advantage, a natural choke point that would completely eliminate the British advantage in size, maneuverability, and range. He found his killing floor at a place called Valcour Island. Valcour Island sat near the western shore of Lake Champlain, creating a narrow, half-mile-wide strait between the island and the New York mainland. Arnold sailed his 15 vessels deep inside this narrow channel, arranging them in a tight crescent-shaped line across the water, completely hidden from the main lake route. His strategy was pure tactical genius. The prevailing October winds on Lake Champlain blew from the north toward the south. Arnold knew Carleton's heavy ships would be sailing south down the main lake channel with the wind at their backs. As the British fleet crested the northern edge of Valcour Island, the strong wind would carry them right past Arnold's hidden position before they even realized he was there. To turn around and engage Arnold inside the narrow strait, the giant British warships would have to turn back toward the north, fighting directly against the fierce headwind. The heavy British frigates would be unable to maneuver, forced to tackle the narrow strait piecemeal, while Arnold's flat-bottomed gondolas sat anchored in formation, ready to blast them at point-blank range. On the morning of October 11, 1776, Carleton's fleet swept past the island. Just as Arnold predicted, the main British warships overshot the channel before spotting the American mastheads tucked behind the trees. British lookout officers shouted in surprise. Shifting sail, Carleton ordered his fleet to turn around and attack, but the heavy wind made it nearly impossible for his biggest warships to tack up into the narrow channel. Only the smaller British gunboats and the schooner Carleton managed to beat their way against the howling wind into the strait. At 11 a.m., the battle erupted with a deafening roar. For 7 continuous hours, Valcour Strait became a hellscape of fire, smoke, and flying splintered wood. The narrow channel concentrated the noise into a thunderous roar that echoed for miles across the mountains. Arnold personally moved from vessel to vessel on his flagship, the Congress, pointing and aiming the heavy naval cannons himself when his inexperienced gun crews panicked under fire. Thick, grey black powder smoke rolled across the water in dense curtains, blinding gunners on both sides. Heavy British cannonballs tore through the unseasoned pine sides of the American vessels, spraying razor-sharp wooden splinters that impaled sailors on deck. The American schooner Royal Savage ran aground under heavy fire, sat burning along the shoreline, and was eventually abandoned. By late afternoon, Arnold's fleet was taking a savage beating. His flagship had been hit over dozens of times. Its hull was leaking heavily, and 3 of his smaller gondolas were sinking or dead in the water. Over 60 American sailors lay dead or severely wounded on blood-slicked decks. The remaining men were completely deaf from the thunderous artillery, covered in black soot, shivering from the freezing spray, and running dangerously low on gunpowder. At 5 p.m., As dusk began to settle over the freezing lake, Carleton pulled his gunboats back out of range to reorganize his line. The British commander felt total confidence. He positioned his massive fleet in a tight, impenetrable semicircle across the southern exit of the Valcour Channel. Carleton locked down the strait completely. He had Arnold trapped against the shore with a wall of heavy warships, waiting only for dawn to finish off the remaining American vessels. From the British quarterdecks, the victory seemed absolute. Arnold had nowhere to go, no gunpowder left for a prolonged fight, and a fleet of crippled wooden wrecks. Carleton retired to his cabin for a victory dinner, ordering his sentries to keep a sharp eye out for any desperate American charge at first light. He was certain the American Revolution on Lake Champlain would end at sunrise. As night fell over Valcour Island on October 11th, a freezing rain began to fall. The temperature plummeted toward freezing. On board the battered American flagship Congress, Benedict Arnold gathered his surviving officers in the dark. The situation was desperate. Over 3/4 of their gunpowder was gone. Their ship hulls were splintered, leaking, and full of water. Hundreds of wounded men were groaning on the cold, blood-soaked decks. Behind them sat a wall of granite cliffs. In front of them sat 30 British warships packed with heavy artillery, waiting for sunrise to blow them out of the water. Every standard military textbook said Arnold had two options: surrender his fleet or launch a suicidal bayonet charge across the water. Arnold chose a third option, a move so insanely reckless that the British never even considered it possible. He decided to slip his entire fleet right through the middle of the British battle line in pitch-black darkness. Around 10 p.m., a heavy, thick fog rolled off the icy mountains, blanketing the entire lake in a dense, blinding mist. You could not see 5 feet in front of your face. Arnold saw his window. He ordered every ship to extinguish all onboard lanterns, fires, and cooking torches. Strict radio-like silence was enforced across the entire fleet. Any man who spoke, coughed, or dropped an iron tool would be executed on the spot. To prevent the metal oars from clanking against the wooden rowlocks, Arnold had his men wrap heavy wool blankets and oily rags around every single oar. To guide the ships through the blinding fog without running into each other, a single small lantern was mounted on the stern of each vessel. But there was a catch. The lantern was placed inside a deep wooden box, with only a tiny slit facing backward, so only the ship directly behind it could see the faint pinpoint of light. At midnight, the ghost fleet began to move. Leading the line was the Gundalow Trumbull, gliding silently into the dark water. One by one, in a single, fragile line, the battered American ships crept along the shallow New York shoreline, staying as close to the dark cliffs as possible. They passed within a few hundred yards of the British warships. American sailors held their breath, clutching cold wooden railings, watching the glowing yellow stern lights of British frigates through the thick fog. They could hear British sentries pacing on deck, the creak of British anchor chains, and the muffled voices of Royal Navy officers chatting in their cabins. One mistake, one dropped bucket, one accidental musket discharge, and 30 British warships would open fire, chewing the fragile American fleet to pieces. But the ragtag crew of farmers, carpenters, and teenagers pulled their muffled oars in total, terrifying silence. For 2 agonizing hours, ship after ship ghosted through the narrow gap between the British fleet and the rocky shore. By 3 a.m., the impossible had happened. Arnold's entire surviving fleet had slipped clean past the British blockade without triggering a single alarm. They were out in the open lake, rowing furiously south into the dark. When the sun crested the mountains on the morning of October 12th, the fog lifted off Valcour Strait. General Guy Carleton stepped onto his quarterdeck, glass in hand, ready to watch his heavy cannons obliterate the American fleet. He looked through his telescope and froze. The strait was completely empty. Arnold was gone. His entire fleet had vanished into thin air. Carleton was so furious that he reportedly lost his temper on deck, shouting orders for his captains to weigh anchor immediately and pursue the ghost fleet down the lake at full sail. The British pursuit was relentless. Furious over being outsmarted by a makeshift American fleet, General Guy Carleton ordered his fastest warships to catch Benedict Arnold. For 2 agonizing days, a desperate running battle raged down Lake Champlain. Arnold's ships were battered, leaking water, and manned by exhausted crews who had been rowing without sleep for over 48 hours. On October 13th, near Split Rock, the fastest British frigates finally caught up with the crippled American rear guard. Carleton's flagship, the Inflexible, along with the Maria and Carleton, surrounded Arnold's flagship Congress and 4 smaller gundelows. A brutal, point-blank firefight erupted. For over 2 hours, Arnold fought like a man possessed, personally aiming his ship's remaining cannons, while British broadsides tore through his wooden hulls. Outgunned and completely surrounded, Arnold realized his ships could no longer escape down the lake. Rather than letting the British capture his warships, heavy cannons, and naval supplies, Arnold made a final, defiant decision. He ordered his captains to run their vessels aground into a shallow, rocky bay on the Vermont shore. As the ships struck the rocks, Arnold ordered his men to set fire to every single vessel. He refused to strike his colors. The American battle flags remained flying proudly from the masts as flames consumed the wooden hulls. Arnold personally stayed on board his burning flagship until the fire reached the powder magazine, making sure no British boarding party could put out the flames. He was the last man to jump off the burning deck into the shallow water, carrying his men safely into the woods toward Fort Ticonderoga. On paper, the Battle of Valcour Island was a decisive British tactical victory. Arnold lost 11 of his 15 ships. Over 80 American sailors were killed or wounded, and his makeshift navy was completely destroyed. But strategically, Valcour Island was one of the most important victories of the entire Revolutionary War. By building that green timber fleet at Skensborough and forcing Carleton to fight inside Valcour Strait, Benedict Arnold had delayed the British invasion by over 3 crucial months. By the time Carleton's army finally secured control of Lake Champlain in late October 1776, the brutal northern winter had arrived. Cold mountain blizzards and icy lake winds made a large-scale military march down the Hudson River impossible. Carleton looked at the heavy snow, looked at the remaining defenses at Fort Ticonderoga, and made the fateful call to turn his entire 13,000-man army around and retreat back to Canada for the winter. That delay saved the American Revolution. It gave George Washington and the Continental Army the precious time they desperately needed to survive the dark winter of 1776, execute the miraculous crossing of the Delaware River at Trenton, and keep the spark of independence alive. When the British returned south the following year, in 1777, under General John Burgoyne, the Americans were ready, organized, and rested. They trapped and defeated Burgoyne's entire army at the Battle of Saratoga, a victory made possible because Arnold bought them a year at Valcour Island. History remembers Benedict Arnold as America's ultimate traitor for what he did years later at West Point. But on a freezing lake in October 1776, he was the master tactician who built a navy from raw trees, outsmarted the British Empire, and executed a midnight escape that saved a newborn nation from dying in its cradle.